Cool. We are live. So today we are here to have our final Q&A with the speaker of the year, Dea Bankova. And I'm really excited to hear from her. Her projects are just so amazing and incredible to look at and interact with. So I can't wait to learn more about them. Before we get started though, first, there is our final tea time of the year tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. So if you're an early career data visualization practitioner, and even if you're not, come say hi, meet others in the field, and network. And then, sorry, my brain's a little frazzled. There are previous Q&As available on YouTube, so you can check them out if you haven't already seen them. This one will be up later today as well. So if you have to leave early, no worries. You can come back and watch the conclusion later. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over. So let's get started.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, I haven't done this platform before, so fingers crossed everything was fine. But no, thank you everyone. Thank you for coming and thank you for the introduction. Yeah, thank you for making the time. It's also, my brain is also a little bit frazzled, so I'll do my best to stay coherent, and hopefully this should be something that there should be something for everyone in. But without further ado, so my name is Dea. It's really lovely to meet you. And I'm a data visualization developer at Reuters, and I'm based in London. And I've been at Reuters for the last 3 years. But I usually say that my title is data visualization developer or graphics journalist, but it doesn't really truly capture very truthfully exactly my day-to-day work or the kinds of work I do for my creative projects. So I tend to say maybe I'm a creative developer. I use code to make data visualizations, data art, and occasionally other things as I feel like. So today I want to talk to you about specifically how you can have fun with coding to create data visualizations and data art. But more broadly, I just want to talk about how I have fun with code in any kind of project, and specifically with JavaScript, specifically with things like D3 and data viz, and how I iterate on projects and how I actually have fun with stuff that I do on the side outside of work, and how I use those personal projects to sort of inform what I can do at work as well, and vice versa. Yeah, just very quickly about me. As I said, I'm currently based at Reuters. This presentation is mostly going to be about my personal projects and unrelated so much to my employer, and all expressing personal views here. I had, I think as a lot of people in data viz, a slightly unusual path into data viz. So I originally studied maths at uni, and then I worked in data science and machine learning. And I realized that I really missed the more visual aspects of work and seeing the output of what I was making in a more visual and creative way. And I was really lucky to essentially wander into the field of data viz when I was doing an exchange year in Japan. So I ended up working at the University of Tokyo as a data visualization, sort of something like a researcher. So I worked on data viz driven archives. And that was really my entrance point into the world of data viz. And it's been about less than 5 years, maybe four and a bit years I've been professionally doing data visualization. So I wouldn't say I'm an experienced expert by any means. But I think because I haven't been doing this for a huge amount of time, I still remember the pain points of learning to code and learning how to use JavaScript, how to make my custom visualizations, all of that goodness. So hopefully for those of you who are thinking of learning or in the process of learning to code or to make data visualization with code, I will remember enough of those pain points to be able to address them if you have any questions. But today, I mostly want to focus on how I work on personal projects. And I'm going to use that as a vehicle to talk about specifically what my goals are, how I use those to pick up new skills. But specifically, I want to focus on the coding aspect of that. So hopefully that's what you are expecting. And hopefully there'll be something in there for you. And again, just a not so much of a disclaimer, but really it's all extremely personal. So I don't think there's any right or wrong approach to work on personal projects. I don't think there's any right or wrong approach to learn things. This is just my experience. And I find that learning about other people's experiences for me has helped me figure out my own style. So yeah, this is just to maybe give you some food for thought, hopefully. So what I want to cover today is through the lens of personal projects. We'll split into two parts. One will be examples, and through the examples, I'll show you both the kinds of tools I use and also how I approach these projects. And in the second part, I'm going to give concrete examples and advice about tools and techniques and where you can go and learn them if you're interested in making similar stuff to what I do. But first things first, how I work on personal projects. I've got very, very simple kind of ideas about that, which I've distilled over time. And that is to work on something that I personally really care about. Then the second thing is to break down the technical implementation in steps. And we'll talk a lot about that. And my third kind of goal every time is to make and share intermediate results. And that is what keeps me motivated. And maybe these are some obvious things, but they weren't always obvious to me. So I like to point them out because when I was starting out initially, I think I worked on a lot of projects where I was doing data visualizations that I felt would be interesting to other people, or I felt that the topics were important, etc. And that was really useful for me to start with. But I find that after you've done this for an initial period of time, and especially if you go and do this full time at work, it's really hard to want to do more of that after you've clocked out of work. So for me, working on topics that I personally am really passionate about is what keeps me going. And hopefully you'll see what I mean. So yeah, just to dive right into that, I want to start with some examples. And if you have any questions, I am looking at the chat. So if you have any kind of more smaller questions about specific things I say, I'll try to address them as they come up. But if you have more general, bigger questions, I'll leave a lot of time at the end. So hopefully we'll get to that. And if you have any questions afterwards, I'll leave my details so you can always contact me. So I'll mostly talk about personal projects because, it kind of is the focus of this presentation. It's how I use personal projects as a vehicle to learn new things and experiment and have fun and learn, and then maybe use those techniques at work. But I do have just one example from work, which I'll start with, which is this piece. And maybe later if we can share the presentation, I have lots of links in it. But essentially, if you just give me 1 second, I'll try to get this on the screen. Yeah, okay, hopefully that will work. So the first one that I very briefly want to show and talk about is this piece from a couple of years ago. And it is a piece that essentially just focuses on one very big number. And it's a very familiar problem to have in data viz, where you're trying to humanize the data, and you have this massive number, and it's really hard to convey to people what that really means. And now it's a very common technique to use those kinds of visualizations that I'm showing right now. But I think even just a couple of years ago, it wasn't immediately obvious to me how I would write this in code. So here, each dot represents one person, one refugee from Ukraine. That was a couple of years ago. And this adds up to more than 5 million dots. So I started with this idea for how I wanted to represent this number, but I didn't have the tools to do it yet. So I was learning 3JS, and this is done in 3JS. And I thought, okay, this is definitely a WebGL 3JS kind of project. So on the technical aspect, I broke it down in pieces. And I thought, okay, what do I need here? I need to be able to show 5 million dots. That's going to be WebGL 3JS. And then the second ingredient I need to be able to animate them, because as you can see, they're moving from one shape to another and from sort of inside of the shape to outside of it, like you're looking from outside in. And in the process of that, let me just show you this. The point that I'm trying to make with this is more about how I broke the problem down into more manageable chunks. So these are the things I identified. And what I did was I thought, okay, what do I need to learn and what do I need to do? And I started experimenting. And I learned how to make the particles. And then I made this notebook, an observable, which only just does one thing. It will create a box of particles and it will animate them with GSAP. And the goal was this, so I can teach myself how to integrate GSAP with Three.js particles. And then I can take this very kind of isolated piece of code and then put it into a more complicated whole as a such. And this is kind of the principle that I normally follow when I make more complex custom visualizations and pages, is that I just break it down into small chunks and in isolation code a single example that will just address that one issue. And then the other point I want to make with this is I put this in observable, and I often put my work out there in observable and open processing on GitHub. And I find that to be also a really effective way to stay motivated as well, because A, it's reusable code for me, so I can refer back to it, and B, it's giving back to the community and is being useful. So hopefully someone else will find it and will use it in the same way that I look at other people's code. So that's something that I would highly recommend in general. But to go into more complex examples, I'm not going to spend, too much. But so this one is a piece that I did as a personal project. And it actually took a very long time. So I had to keep motivated for over half a year to complete this. But this is a piece called Infinity, and it's kind of about the mathematical concept of infinity, which I realize can be quite daunting. And I also realized that maths is not everyone's favorite subject. But as I said at the beginning, I'm at the stage where whenever I choose what project to work on, I tend to choose projects that are on topics I'm really passionate about. And I'm really passionate about maths. It was what I studied originally. So I really wanted to do something which is just really fun and really kind of takes away that scary image that maths has and says, you know, this is actually something that's really fun and really beautiful, and I want more people to know about it. So let's make something that will give me joy and hopefully other people joy. So that was my biggest motivation. And for this piece, you can see the tools I've listed, but it uses a lot of tools that work amazing in isolation. But the biggest pain point on this project was combining them. And that was the biggest learning that I wanted to do for myself by working on this project. So not only have fun with it, but also, obviously, for every personal project I do, I have a goal for myself of what I want to learn. And for this particular project, it was, how do I start combining all of these tools and frameworks in a way that will actually work together? So for example, for those of you who are familiar, I decided to use React and D3. Yes, there's lots of patterns. It's kind of known how you do that these days, but let's do React and D3 and GSAP. All right, how do we do that? And then how do we add some Three.js onto that and React 3 Fiber? And oh, maybe I need some Canvas. So it was pretty much all of the tools that I might use for one thing or another in isolation, I was trying to combine. So that was my biggest challenge on this project. And I'll get a little bit into how I kind of break down that problem into stages. Sorry, I'm trying to find my mouse. Okay, cool. But I just wanted to talk very briefly about how I kept motivated as well on this one. So at one point, I was getting burned out. It was a very long project. So I took a break and I literally just made a spin-off. So I just made this mini game called the Infinite Monkey Theorem, which is extremely simple. You just keep pressing buttons until you happen to get a 5-letter word, which is a real word in English. And there's a theorem in maths, which is not really a theorem, but it kind of says that, if you let a monkey bang on the keys of a typewriter for long enough, eventually, in a finite amount of time, they will complete the entire works of Shakespeare. So That's just something that kind of is a way to show you how infinity is so different to a finite amount of time, because a finite amount of time is even as long a time as it takes a monkey to type the entire works of Shakespeare, which was pretty cool. But anyway, it was just a point to make that I made this page just as a spin-off, because I knew I could do this maybe in the weekend, and it kind of brought me back to the bigger project, and it made me want to look at it again with fresh eyes. And I made a lot of other things along the way, so I won't show you everything, but just a couple of examples. At one point, I thought I would include something on fractals. Just show you this. And that didn't end up happening, but it was really fun because, I was just making these sketches on open processing, and it's like a really fun self-contained thing which you can do in a couple of hours and just put out there and feel like you've accomplished something. And these ones, I followed some videos by the Coding Train, which I highly recommend if you're learning anything with P5 or creative coding. So I made a bunch of these, and I had a lot of fun, and it just gave me this kind of feeling that I'm making progress. And I did the same with some other ideas, like, for example, this one here is some Penrose styles, which are really fun to look at. And this was the initial visualization of digits of pi that I did. But my point with all of these things is just that it was a longer term project. So it was really hard to just keep going, especially because it was technically so challenging. And I think doing these like small sketches or smaller projects that kind of were in a similar topic, and then putting them out there and showing them to people, and just doing them for myself, that's kind of one of the things that kept me going. I'll do one more slide and I'll have a look at the questions, because I see there a couple. But yeah, my last kind of point on this one is I cannot stress this enough. If you're thinking of doing personal projects, you're doing this in your own time, and no one is going to pay you for this. So you have to have fun. You have to make something that you love, because you're not going to do it otherwise. So I do this a lot in my personal projects. And in this particular one, I just put random stuff like, as I put here, completely unnecessary interactions or completely irrelevant cat mascots. Why? Because I like cats. I chose the aesthetic to be kind of city pop Sailor Moon aesthetic, just because that appealed to me and because I wanted to make it look fun and engaging. So every single choice I made on this project was my choice. And that doesn't mean there weren't iterations. There were so many iterations, and I changed the style completely like 5 times. But I think this is nice because it's different, because you're making the decision every time. So it doesn't feel like it's coming from anyone else, and maybe you have disagreements. So it's just like a very sort of easy, safe environment for you to experiment with things, because it's all up to you at the end of the day. And in the next one, I'll go a little bit about my process. So before I do that, I just wanted to have a look if any questions I can answer now or later. What's the research just mentioned? Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so I'm just kind of reading the questions. Okay, I think the question by Damu is a little bit more involved, so I might leave that to get back to you separately. The other question, how does GSAP specific role in this project? So that is for, let me see if I can bring it up. I'll very, very, very briefly try to mention this. So for those of you who haven't used Three.js before, don't worry about what I'm saying. I'll be very quick. But essentially, GSAP is used for all the animations. So what you see right now, let me just see if you're seeing this. Yeah. So what you see right now, I'm animating the camera. And that was in the end the easiest way to do that. So essentially, it's just one static scene, and then you're animating the camera so that it's moving from inside out. So in the end, I didn't animate the particles, but it was a previous iteration of this project had the particles animate as well. So this was animating just the camera. And then I'm also using GSAP to do this little animation here. So as you scroll, it just turns into a graph. So all of this is on the page with D3 and GSAP and with Svelte. It's not a static graphic that I exported. So long story short.
Honor clarified that 3GS GSAP division of labor was what he was particularly curious about.
Yeah, GSAP is just doing the animation. 3GS is doing everything else. So yeah, in this case, GSAP is just moving the camera in the particular. Okay, cool. Yeah, if you have more questions on that specific one, I'm happy to take that offline as well. Okay, sorry, let me just get back to, oops, this slide. I have a lot of links, which I realize you cannot see. Okay, cool. So that's the final personal project that I wanted to mention. And this one, it's kind of two parts. One is entirely just generative art, creative coding, and the other one is data art. But they're kind of related in terms of the tech that I used and the approaches that I used on them. But if you are interested, I'm going to very quickly try to show you. But essentially, the art one is, this one is using my camera. So if I start, it might freeze my video. I'm not entirely sure if this is a good idea to show you. But essentially, it will track my hands if I wave them in front of the camera. And I don't know if you saw that because it was frozen for me. And it will move those dragonflies according to the position of my hands. So you can interact with the sketch that way. And the other one, which is maybe a bit more relevant to us because it's data viz, is this piece, which is data art piece, which represents all the lines that were spoken by the main characters in dialogue in Haruki Murakami's book, Norwegian Wood. And each line that a character says becomes a Voronoi region in their respective butterfly wings. And as they talk, the butterflies move. And also each time a song is mentioned in the book, it will create a new flower in the sketch. So it's just, again, it's entirely a data art piece and not a data visualization one. But it let me experiment with a lot of different techniques. And I do want to mention kind of how this worked for me and how I approached it. But if you're curious, the tools, it's really a lot of my usual tools. It's JavaScript with D3, Canvas, and P5. And I also used ML5JS for one of them, which is this machine learning library, which will allow you to do things like detect the location of your fingers or different points on your face. So you can start using those data points to control your sketches. It's really, really fun. So that was one of the things I wanted to challenge myself to learn with this particular project. And as you can see, so these were kind of like my to-do list for myself. So these are some new things that I wanted to learn. And I want to show you a snippet. So I know this is quite small, but it really is just to give you a flavor of how I tend to work on these projects. So what you see here is literally a screenshot from my Notion that I use to keep track of things. And for this one, I essentially started with this image here on the top right-hand side corner, which is a painting. I forget who it's by, unfortunately, but I saw it and I thought this is really cute and I really want to recreate something like this with code. And this was my starting point, and the end result ended up looking very different, which is perfectly okay. But when that's your starting point, you don't really have any pointers. It's not like someone's going to tell you, you need to do this in this library, right? There's no recipe for how to do this. So the way that I would do it is I start identifying what my ingredients are, which I need to kind of stack up on top of each other in order to be able to produce something like this. And what you see here is kind of how I think about this. So for example, I identified that, first of all, I need to practice using this Path2D API, which is part of Canvas, which allows you to draw paths like in SVG, but in Canvas. So then I just created one path, right, just to see how it's done. And then I had to start using Path2D in Canvas together with P5.js because I wanted to work in P5. So then I made another sketch that just did that. And then I thought, okay, then I need to be able to animate that path. So how am I going to do this? I made another sketch that just did that, right? Etc. 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 So each bit was building on top of the previous one and just adding one layer of complexity. And that is a way to just keep things manageable. In general, when you code, I find that I always do things kind of building on top of each other and very iteratively. And here again, I'm not going to show you all of these, but this is just a small sample of all of the intermediate notebooks that I produced as I was learning how to do this. And it's really fun this way because you feel like, oh, I just learned something new, right? So it feels like, I get this like little dopamine reward for having done something new, even if you haven't completed your sketch yet. So yeah, each thing was building on top of the other. And the cool thing is also you get these kind of delightful surprises. So I'll just show you one of them, but these are all just sketches from some of the iterations that I did. Just one moment to open it. Yeah, so this one might make you dizzy after a while, but essentially that was just a mistake. So the animation isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing, but I thought this was actually kind of fun, so I kept it. And I get a lot of these, and I think that's part of my process, and it's part of what makes it fun to learn new things and work on things. Yeah, so this is more or less kind of the end of the examples bit, so it will get a little bit more practical after this. But did you have any? I don't think there are any more questions in the chat, but if you had any like specific examples. How accessible are these data visualizations? So the data art pieces that I work on are right now very inaccessible, unfortunately. But as such, accessibility is something that I've really been focusing on this year at work, specifically doing data visualizations for US elections. I spend a lot of time making sure these are entirely accessible by keyboard and voice. So I feel like because I've done this at work now, I know how to do it more properly. I will start integrating it into personal projects. So it's actually it's gone the other way around this time around. Usually it's personal projects going into work, but I think it's going to go the other way around. But I think when it comes to data art, it's maybe a bit more creative and open to interpretation how you're going to make this accessible, because you don't want to just describe necessarily exactly what's happening on the screen and that's your accessibility feature. You might want to create a different experience which is as equivalent as possible to someone who's only using a keyboard or only using voiceover, etc. I think it's like a really interesting topic when it comes to when it comes to data art. And I think it is something I'll explore more next year. So hopefully we'll have more to talk about. But very long kind of story short on that as well is like there are pieces of functionality you can use in libraries like P5. So for example, P5 allows you to use describe. There's just a describe function where you can put text that will describe your sketch. So that's kind of the bare minimum you can do. So at least your sketch is accessible. I'll just having a look at the other questions. Explore new coding libraries. How much time do you tend to take to work on a? It's a great question, Stephanie. I'm just reading the one by Stephanie. So do you just, thank you. Yeah, do you just pull from coding libraries that you're already familiar with? When you start a personal projects, do you have to explore new coding libraries? It's a mix. There are some libraries which are useful for like almost every project, like D3, very often GSA, very often P5.js, very often 3.js for me. And then when it comes to frameworks, at work I use Svelte, and for personal projects I sometimes use React. And I sometimes force myself to use React just so that I don't forget it, because I think it's always good to be able to code in at least 2 frameworks. So basically I use personal projects as ground to practice the libraries that I maybe don't use as often at work, just so I can stay current at everything. And then any new libraries occasionally. So most new libraries are going to be just doing like one specific thing. Say, for example, like a library that will make your shapes look like hand-drawn or rough. It's a very small kind of self-contained thing. So yeah, I will occasionally pick up something new that does something specific that I want to do. And then I just want to address the one about, do I consider responsive mobile development at this stage of the development? For personal projects, I don't, because as I said, I do these for fun, and developing for mobile is extremely not fun for me. But for work, I start thinking about mobile from the very beginning, because if you don't, especially if it's a more interactive or code-heavy project, you will struggle to adapt it for mobile later on. So I tend to think about mobile from the very beginning. Yeah, and I think I partially answered the question by Shuai, hopefully I'm saying this right, about the React to Svelte. So the question is, how do I pick whether to use React or Svelte? And the answer is, I have to use Svelte at work, so I'm better at Svelte by a mile. I prefer Svelte as well for data visualization because it has, it's kind of more tailored and geared towards data visualization. So it's really straightforward for a lot of the tasks I want to do. On the other hand, React has still at this point in time a more rich ecosystem for libraries, such as, especially with 3D, like 3JS with React Refiber is really powerful in React. And that's why I try to stay current in React as well. So if I'm doing something with 3D, I'll probably pick React for a personal project rather than Svelte. And sometimes I'll pick React just so that I don't forget it, just so I can keep using it. So there's no hard and fast rule really for me. Okay, I think I know there are a couple more questions, but I think it's a good time for me to actually go in the next section because it might answer some of them, and then I'll go back to the ones that I haven't answered yet. Okay, just a second. Yeah, okay, so I realized that this is probably kind of a mixed audience of different experiences and different level of comfort with code, but I'm going to try to sell you on why coding is so much fun. See if I succeed. But anyway, so this section, I just want to touch upon very practical advice about what I personally think is very useful in my work and what I would learn if I was starting now, or what I'm focusing on now, etc. So, okay. Yeah, so I kind of start with this Q&A because I think these are questions that I've been asked quite often. So hopefully maybe that'll answer some of your questions too. And again, this is entirely a personal opinion. And I think some people might think, have strong views one way or another, but I think that there's no way we can predict what's going to happen in tech in even another year because, yeah, there's so many things happening right now. So this is how I see it at this point in time. But I say be flexible and always kind of keep an eye on how things are developing and try to adapt to that. But at this point in time, this is what I think. Take it with a pinch of salt. Something I often get asked is, if I was starting now, would I still learn a good amount of just vanilla JavaScript with HTML and CSS, or would I just go straight into D3, or would I just pick up Svelte, right? Because Svelte does so much now. And my answer is I would start from vanilla JavaScript, and I would keep at it until at least you feel comfortable, until you understand all of the kinds of things that come up quite often. And the reason for that is because it helps you understand what's happening underneath the hood in a lot of cases, which gives you more tools to use. And B, at this point in time, there is no framework that will give you everything you need. So you will hit a point at which you're still using the framework, like Svelte, for example, but you need to essentially go out of it and just go a little bit more low level and say, okay, I need to use this with this library, which only works with vanilla JavaScript and not with Svelte. So that means that I need to be able to use vanilla JavaScript as well. And I need to be able to integrate that with how Svelte works. And you're not going to be able to do that if you haven't learned just vanilla JavaScript first. And that is just kind of how it is at the moment, and probably will be for a little while, in my opinion. And that is also why D3, I think, is still extremely helpful. There are a lot of instances for data viz where I still use D3, even when I'm working with Svelte. So I'll use D3 to define things like scales, sometimes axes. I use it for a lot of computation. So for example, computing a Voronoi diagram, I would still use D3 for that. Computing layouts in general, D3 is extremely useful for this. So I would still use D3. And if you've never touched D3 before, it is useful to learn the whole package, even if you don't intend to use just D3, if you always intend to use it in a framework, because again, it's an extremely amazing community and a lot of resources developed around D3. So you'd be able to use those resources to learn and for your own charts, etc. So for example, you'd go on Observable and there'll be so many examples in just pure D3. And if you want to use those, you kind of need to understand what is happening in there. So yeah, I would still learn D3. And then I guess there's always the question of, should I even learn to code? And specifically for data viz, there's so many wonderful no-coding tools out there. And they're getting more and more sophisticated, and there's more and more that you can do without ever writing a line of code, which I think is really great. And I think it's, I'm all for democratizing kind of the process of anything which is currently behind the wall of code, I guess. But as it is right now, I don't think any of them will allow you to kind of break outside of essentially what it allows you to do. So for example, every charting library will have kind of a set of charts that are available in it. And if you want to do something which is maybe completely novel, or combine them in a novel way, or do data art, or create your entire page from scratch, you will need to resort to coding at this point in time. So if this is what you want to do, then that's where I'd recommend learning JavaScript and these libraries. And it is also cool because, as you're learning how to make data visualizations in code, you're also learning how to code in general and how to think in that specific way and how to make your entire page. So you have complete creative freedom. And for me, this is really fun, especially once you feel comfortable enough in it, it starts to become more and more fun. I think it's just like anything else. And just to touch a bit about AI, isn't AI just going to do all of it anyway? I do use AI to help me with my work sometimes, especially on personal stuff. It's definitely not there yet. I'm not going to make a comment on whether it will get there. I don't know. But I do find it to be a useful companion. But right now, as it stands, for me, it hasn't been at the point where I can just tell it what I want and expect it to give me a complete working example. And I just put some things that have worked for me or haven't worked for me. But the long story short is, if it's something that's like a very well-established language or pattern, something that's been around for a long time, therefore there's a lot of information about that on the internet that the AI has used to learn from, it is going to be good at it. I use it a lot as a replacement of documentation, essentially. So instead of going and trying to find an answer to my question about something I've forgotten how to do in the documentation of a specific library, I can just ask AI, oh, how do you do this in GSAP? And you'll get a standalone example. It's really great for that. Same for anything that you'd use Stack Overflow for. You can also do that in AI these days, and it's probably faster. And then I've had some mixed success and stuff like debugging my code, trying to help it kind of to debug my code, more complex, non-conventional problems, and producing code in the style that I want it to be in, or in the kind of way of structuring that I want it to be in. It's not really going to do that for you. And And then for some things, it's just really bad. And you can see that really clearly, like anything that hasn't been around for a long time, any complete non-trivial examples that would just work. So if you tell it, make me a bar chart with this data, it will make you a bar chart and it will work. But anything which is a lot more complex than that, it usually won't just work. And I think you'll get more confused than not, because if you're not able to kind of read through it and understand what could have gone wrong, then you might not be able to fix it, and then it would just be very frustrating. So I would recommend using AI as a companion if you choose to. But I wouldn't give up on learning to code just because we have these tools right now. I would personally just use it as a tool. And I'm just getting to my very kind of last slide before I go into some questions. But yeah, as I mentioned, I think at the beginning, I started to learn front-end development from scratch, starting from JavaScript about 5 years ago. And I've been working in data visualization for just over 4. So I've seen quite a lot of resources, and I do find it useful to essentially watch different resources. I prefer video, and just follow along, and then go away and work on a personal project that uses that knowledge, and then go back and learn a bit more, and then also rewatch the same thing. So I find that this kind of reinforcement loop of, watch something, understand maybe 70% of it, go and work on it, and then get your understanding up to 90, and then go back to it and watch it again, and now you actually understand it. So I did that a lot when I was teaching myself. And these links, which I now realize that you won't be able to click on, hopefully you can screenshot this. And if you Google these, if not, I'll try to share this slide deck later. Yeah, so these are my recommendations. So personally, I've done all of these, watched all of these courses, read these blog posts, and they've helped me tremendously. So I'd highly recommend Karen Kelleher's YouTube video series to learn D3, and also D3 and React. And then these are all free. And then if you have a subscription to Front-End Masters, maybe from work or otherwise, Shirley Wu has really great courses as well, which talk not only about the technical stuff around D3 and React, but also just about principles of data visualizations. So really, really good course. Nadi Bremer has some blog posts they're from some time ago, but they're still extremely relevant. And I would recommend these for maybe when you've already been doing some coding with data viz, so some SVG and D3, and you want to deepen this and start making these really beautiful visualizations. You have some really great stuff for that. And then on the Svelte side, so Svelte recently, so as of very recently, we have Svelte 5, which I haven't started using yet, so I can't really speak much to that. And the resources you come across now more likely being Svelte 4, but I think next year you'll probably see more Svelte 5 out there. So I would recommend Matthias Stahl's YouTube series. I think if you Google his name and Svelte, you'll find them in YouTube. So these are really great. They'll cover pretty much all of the main patterns you'd use Svelte and D3 with. And then I also had one that I made for work, which is this one, which is just a few different patterns of how you can use Svelte with D3 with code snippets. So it would have stuff like how to start writing simple charts in Svelte and D3, and then it'll move on to things like how you can do scrollytelling, again with Svelte and D3. And then I think there's also a bit of how you can, so stuff like that, just very common use cases. And then there's a bit on GSAP as well, I think. So again, this is at this point maybe a little bit old. It's still relevant, but hopefully we'll start seeing some Svelte 5 next year. Yeah, these are, I'd say, my top resources that I would go with. And yeah, I saw that someone is asking if we'll share the slides. So hopefully we'll find a way. Yeah, we'll share them afterwards on email. Sorry about this. There are actually tons of links in here. Yeah, so this is sort of the end of the slides as such. So I do want to check out the questions. Please ask whatever you feel like I've missed or you want me to expand on. And you can always email me or try to follow me on the socials and ask me there. I'm more than happy to connect and answer any more questions that you have. So I'm just going to take a moment to have a sip of water and I'll have a look at the questions.
So we have one from Damu, I hope I'm saying that right, earlier in the conversation. How to effectively visualize the batch jobs by category and success or failure that ran in the system over a period of time?
Yeah, I think this is about how you'd make a specific visualization about a problem that they have. So I'm assuming they have a system that runs over time and that system has batch jobs and they have categories and you want to visualize success and failure. We can try to brainstorm afterwards because I think, yeah, it's maybe a bit specific. Would you like to connect and brainstorm if you have like a specific project that you're interested in working on?
Here, maybe
Yeah.
Damu, if you want to ping me your email address or something, I can play a matchmaker afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, because it sounds like something where we could brainstorm a bit. I wouldn't say necessarily there's one way to do it. Okay.
Faith asked, I'm brand new to coding and creative coding. I have many ideas for personal projects, and I wonder, how do you go from idea to knowing that you'll need to combine XYZ tools, examples such as React, 3.js, and
Yeah.
GSAP?
Yeah, this is a great question. I think, so my experience when I was starting on initially, and I just essentially followed a path. I said, okay, I'm just going to learn vanilla JavaScript, and then I'll try to do something with what I know. And then I'm going to learn just some more D3 in stages. So I did this 100 days of D3 project where I'll pick a new type of chart that I want to learn to make, and then I'll find data to make it in. And I did this for 100 days. And then I moved on to, actually I did this with React. So yeah, for me, it was just try to pick up some basic skills in a few tools, and then you'd be able to, you'll gain intuition. It just happens really naturally. You start to gain intuition about what works for your specific kind of idea. So I'd say it's really difficult at the beginning, but if you try to limit yourself to the tools that you know and then expand very slowly, you will have necessarily, you will get to this point where you just have an idea and you're like, oh yeah, I think I can do this with GSAP. I think I can do this with D3. So it just kind of comes naturally that way. I think these days I didn't have this available to me. These days you might be able to brainstorm that with AI, just describe the problem and say, can I do this in these frameworks, just to give you an idea if that's something you can use. So I think that is one advantage of that. Otherwise, one thing I did when I was starting out was I found a mentor. So I would ask her, this is the problem I had and this is what I know. So I thought maybe I could do it this way, right? Does that make sense to you? And I think that was something very helpful as well. So I think if you do have that opportunity to talk through it with someone, that helps too.
Guadam had a similar question. From the resources you mentioned, would you recommend starting with Kern's course on D3 directly? And then a follow-up, or would you recommend starting with vanilla JS, HTML, CSS first?
Yeah. So I think it sort of depends if you want to work in data viz, if that's your goal or not, or if your goal is more to learn some front end or some creative coding. But maybe I'll just answer it both ways. If you specifically want to work in data visualization, I would personally recommend learning some JavaScript first, and then going through the more specific D3 courses. I think it will be less confusing. If you are just trying to get into more like creative coding, JavaScript, database, etc. If you just want to start immediately, you can also just start with P5, actually, P5.js. And with the coding train on YouTube, because he has an introductory series where he'll assume no programming knowledge, and he'll focus a lot on concepts and on creating things that you can see on the screen immediately, and less on syntax, right? So it's a lot easier to get into and have more fun with it. So it kind of depends on your goals. I would do one or the other or both.
Kendra asked, how much freedom do you have when designing visualizations for work?
Me personally, it really depends on the type of kind of piece or how many people I'm working with, what the topic is. If it's a longer term project, I'll usually have quite a lot of freedom. If it's something that needs to happen quite quickly, you'll usually be much more constrained. And then sometimes I might be the designer as well as the developer, and other times they might be a designer, an illustrator that I'm working with, and they'll have the vision of how things should look like, and I'm more implementing them. So it really depends on the type of project. I have a lot of variety.
Nice. Kristen asked, what comes first, the technology or the topic?
Yeah, I think both. I think I go through phases. Sometimes I'm just like, I saw this cool new tech, I really want to learn it, so let's find something to make in it. So the technology comes first. Other times it's definitely the topic or the piece that I want to create, and I have this idea, and so I need to figure out a way to make it happen. And it alternates, which I think is a good thing, because if I do one for too long, I start to get burnt out. So yeah.
That's been my experience as well.
Right, yeah.
Addie asks, how do you make the transition from data science, machine learning engineer to what you're doing now? I've done data science for about 5 years, mainly in Python, but find it hard knowing how to start.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I think for me, concretely, what happened to me was that I was working as a machine learning engineer. I went to Japan. I thought I would do more machine learning. When I approached my professor at the lab where I ended up doing a work placement at, because I knew that they were doing some work with machine learning, and I said, and other things as well. I said, oh, maybe I can help you out with the machine learning bits, right? And I was like, yeah, come along. But then I ended up getting more interested in the other work. So I was doing more and more of the visualization part of kind of the data story. So initially I thought it would just be maybe analyzing it, maybe doing a bit of natural language processing, but then I was doing more and more visualization, and I thought this is definitely the direction I want to go into. And then how it happened was that I knew this is what I wanted to do, so I just bit the bullet, whatever the expression is. I don't think that was correct. And I just went and did this really long course in Udemy that I recommended by Angela Yu, which is about full stack development. So not only front end, it was the entire thing, 60 hours or something crazy. Yeah, so I think I tried to take shortcuts. So at first I thought maybe I can do a little bit and then just do D3. And I thought, oh, D3 is like too hard to learn. So I'm just going to try to use a more kind of no code library. And then I kept running into limitations, and I kept thinking, oh, I have to go back and learn it properly. So after a few rounds of negotiating with myself, I just went back to the beginning. And as I mentioned, I did this 100-day of D3 project, which I would recommend doing something like that. Either do something which is, there's a lot of stuff happening in January. There'll probably be this, the generative January thing happening. There's probably going to be some data visualization challenge happening. There's always something happening where you can take part and learn and share and feel like you're part of an experience in a community. So I would recommend doing that, and that will show you what's possible. So it's totally doable if you've worked in machine learning.
I like how you framed that too. I've heard the sentiment before. You said
Yeah.
what happened to you was,
Right.
and I've heard other people say they fell into data viz, they came across data viz and kind of leaned
Yeah.
into it after it started. And so I think that's a common
Yeah.
plot point with many people is they just
Yeah.
it happens to them.
It's so true. And you know what? That was actually part of why I stayed in this field and I really like it, is because I kept hearing my story from other people so many times in different variations. I'm like, well, there's so many of us here. Like we've all had this kind of experience of falling into it and falling in love with it, kind of, which is really nice, you know?
Exactly. It's like data visualization is a field that people find themselves in and then choose to stay in. So
Yeah.
everyone who's here is choosing to be here. And that's just so
Yeah.
unusual and like heartwarming.
I know, yeah. I think these days, because now you can do now you can do university courses in data viz, whereas back when I was at uni, that wasn't really a thing. I think it might start to become more formalized, but yeah, a lot of people from kind of our generation of data visualization people really fell into it, kind of thing. So, yeah.
Speaking of falling into things, Precious asks, I'm new to DataViz and I was wondering how to get an internship or junior role as a D3.js Viz.
Yeah. I wish there was a simple answer to that, because I was wondering the same thing when I got into it. And I think actually it will depend a lot on where you're based and where you want to work, or where you can get authorization, etc. I think it's kind of basically decide whether, like, what kind of industry you want to work in. Data viz, there's a lot of data viz, obviously, in newsrooms and in creative agencies. So what I did was I identified the ones that have bigger teams or stronger teams, or people who do data viz in creative agencies, etc. And I reached out to a lot of people. It was just kind of a matter of asking, how did you end up here? Do you have any formalized internships, etc.? And I think it will be kind of a matter of just identifying those companies and following them and seeing what's out there and what's open. But the good news is that DataViz does have a lot of internships as opposed to other industries, which might not offer internships. They might just be looking to hire someone more experienced, etc. So I think the good news is that there are lots of agencies and some newsrooms which offer internships to university students. So it is a matter of just like finding them, reaching out. Don't be shy about reaching out to people, and also following them to see if they have anything to advertise. It's kind of the best I can say at this point in time, I think.
We are at 1 p.m., so I apologize if we haven't gotten to your questions, but I know that people have things they need to get to. But I'll save these questions and send them to Dea, and she can maybe answer them in some follow-up slides or perhaps in the DBS Slack. But thank you so much. This has been an incredible talk, very visually stunning, and coding is something that's just so nebulous and intimidating that it's fun to see somebody start and get going and make some incredible projects within their own personal time. This is fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very kind. And thank you everyone for being so engaged and asking so many great questions. Really appreciate it. If you want to follow up in any way, please do. Happy to answer any more questions. And thank you for organizing.
Absolutely. All right. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their Monday and holiday season as well, since that is now upon us. Bye, everyone.